In 1796, Australia almost became Spanish territory, while the fragile colony of New South Wales was taking its first steps, filled with convicts, soldiers, and an improvised administration. On the other side of the world, in the secret rooms of the Spanish ministry in Madrid, a general was meticulously planning its total destruction. His name was José de Bustamante y Guerra, and his plan was simple. Spanish ships departing from Chile, disguised as English vessels, would sail to Sydney, take the colony by surprise, arrest the population, burn everything down, and make sure that England would never try to rebuild the settlement. But why, after all, did Spain want to destroy a penal colony at the end of the world? How was Sydney connected to the Spanish Empire? How did Bustamante know the colony so well to plan such a detailed attack? And what prevented this plan from being carried out? In today's video, we're going to reveal the secret Spanish plan to destroy Australia and how a series of unexpected setbacks saved Sydney from extinction. But before we start the video, if you like our content, become a member of our channel right now. This gives you access to our group and exclusive content, like live classes, for a deeper look behind the scenes of history. To understand why Spain wanted to destroy Sydney, we first need to understand how the Spanish viewed the Pacific Ocean up until the 18th century. For Spain, the Pacific wasn't an open ocean, but rather a Spanish sea. Since Vasco Núñez de Balboa sighted the South Sea in 1513, and since Magellan and Elcano crossed it for the first time in 1521, Spain claimed exclusive sovereignty over those waters. To the east, there was the vast coast of the Spanish Americas. To the west, the Mariana Islands and the Philippines. And between those two worlds, that entire Pacific Ocean belonged to Madrid. And for more than 250 years, that claim held true in practice. The Dutch, French, and English could pursue their interests in the Indian Ocean. But in the Pacific, Spain was still the dominant force, with Spain especially controlling the famous route between Manila and Acapulco. But this reality began to change with the arrival of the British. First, with James Cook, whose scientific voyages Spain correctly interpreted as strategic reconnaissance missions. And then, with the establishment of a colony in Botany Bay, Australia in 1788. And over time, the Spanish realized that that small penal colony at the end of the world was, after all, the strategic bridgehead. In times of war, whoever controlled Port Jackson would control the South Pacific. And as time went by, tensions on the Pacific coast began to rise. In 1789, on the northwest coast of North America, on what is now Vancouver Island, Spanish ships captured the English fur trading expedition, arrested its crew, and took the ships to the port of San Blas in Mexico. Spain asserted its right. The Pacific was closed to foreigners. And when the news reached London, both countries mobilized for war. Spain, however, counted on the support of France. But France would end up, shortly after, overthrowing the Bourbons from power. And in this way, without support, the Spanish were forced to retreat and negotiate. Through the Nootka Conventions, Great Britain obtained the right to navigate and fish in the Pacific. And the British knew how to make good use of this right. Dozens of English whalers invaded the South Pacific, many of them using Sydney as a resupply base. And so, what the Spanish saw was almost a legalized invasion in slow motion. And it is in this context that two Spanish naval officers arrive in Sydney in March 1793 aboard two corvettes, the Descubierta and the Atrevida. Alejandro de Malaspina and José de Bustamante y Guerra were leading what Spain called a political scientific voyage around the world. An expedition that, in practice, had as one of its objectives to carry out confidential political inquiries in the English colony of Botany Bay. And the arrival of the Spaniards caused great excitement in the still fragile British colony. The founding governor, Arthur Phillip, had left due to health problems, and the one receiving the visitors was Major Francis Gross. The British settlers were delighted with the well-equipped ships and with the Spanish artists and botanists on board. And the Spanish officers were equally courteous. They strolled along the Parramatta River, took notes on the details of the colony, and admired the newly erected buildings. An officer recorded in his diary that, in a short time, soldiers, all convicts, all were creating a well-ordered community out of nothing, and also that the climate and soil were not so different from Andalusia. But while they were presenting the English with beautiful landscapes drawn by their artists, the Spaniards were also making another kind of record. They were noting and observing secret strategic positions intended especially for the eyes of Madrid. Bustamante wrote everything down: the position of the anchorages, the weakness of the defenses, the condition of the warehouses, the discontent of part of the population. Information that 3 years later would serve as the basis for an invasion plan. The details of the plan are brought to us by an article published by researcher Chris Markworth in the Journal of the Royal Australian Historical Society, which precisely recounts and documents the audacious Spanish plan. At the end of June 1796, with the war between Spain and Great Britain becoming increasingly imminent, Bustamante put on paper what he had been planning since his visit to Sydney. The document, a 120-page memorandum sent to the Minister of the Indies, Pedro de Varela, was a call to action, and its fourth and most daring point described in detail how to destroy the colony of Port Jackson. Bustamante wrote that the destruction of the English colony in Port Jackson is one of the points of greatest interest to the Crown, and one of the easiest to carry out in 6 or 7 months by the Royal Squadron of Peru. The helpless state he had observed in 1793, combined with what he called the general discontent of the inhabitants, would make the conquest almost certain. And even if there was resistance, it could never prevail under the fire of their ships, or else its strategic positions would be totally destroyed. The plan was surgical. Spanish ships would depart from Chile in August, sail towards Tonga, and then turn east, passing north of Norfolk Island before approaching Sydney. And to deceive the sentries, the fleet would pose as English, hiding its artillery to appear to be a supply or convict transport ship. And once the surprise was complete, the Spanish would take the main settlement, followed by Parramatta and Tungab. All the English would be deported as prisoners to the Spanish possessions, and all the strategic points where the English could anchor in that region would be destroyed. And Bustamante advocated for this so that England would not try to rebuild the settlement in times of peace. The plan reached Minister Varela at just the right moment. In August 1796, Spain signed the Treaty of San Ildefonso with France, and a few months later, in October, declared war on Great Britain. Bustamante had made a valuable contribution. His first-hand knowledge of Sydney was unique, and the authorities in Madrid recognized that. He was promoted to political and military governor in Montevideo. However, from that point on, a series of events undid all his plans. The first blow came in February 1797. Near Cape St. Vincent, off the coast of Portugal, the Spanish Navy suffered a devastating defeat against a smaller British squadron under the command of Admiral Jarvis. The battle left the Spanish fleet humiliated and demoralized. The good ships that Bustamante was counting on to sail to Sydney simply no longer existed in sufficient numbers. And the second blow came in June of the same year. Pedro Varela, the minister who had commissioned the plan and was its main sponsor, died in Madrid. And the third setback was structural. The alliance with France, instead of strengthening Spain, was now bleeding its treasury dry. The shipping links with Peru, Mexico, and the Rio de la Plata were constantly cut off by British ships intercepting the gold in the Atlantic. There were no resources to finance an operation on the other side of the world. And ironically, just 3 years after Bustamante submitted his plan, 3 South American ships had already arrived in Sydney, captured by British whalers. Among them, the large merchant ship Nuestra Señora de Belém. And this, in practice, confirmed everything he had predicted about the strategic potential of Port Jackson. Bustamante's career survived the failures. He would later be appointed Captain General of Guatemala, where he would govern for 7 years, resisting the pressures for independence. But his colleague Malaspina met a tragic fate. Upon returning to Spain after the scientific voyage, he tried to get involved in court politics and ended up imprisoned for treason. He spent almost 8 years incarcerated, being released in 1802 at Napoleon's request on the condition that he would never set foot on Spanish soil again. And he would die shortly after, in 1809, weakened by his time in prison. And what's curious about this whole story is that Bustamante's plan was correct in its assessment. Port Jackson was strategically vital. Sydney would, in fact, become the base from which the British would dominate the South Pacific. English whalers, in fact, used the colony to attack Spanish concessions. But Spain simply no longer had the capacity to carry out what its strategic vision indicated. The empire that first circumnavigated the world, that conquered 2 continents and monopolized an entire ocean, was now collapsing. And not for lack of ideas, but for lack of cohesion, resources, and leadership. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain, deposed the Bourbon dynasty, and installed his brother Joseph on the throne. And the balance of power that sustained the American territories disappears. And so, little by little, the Spanish dream of once again dominating the entire Pacific finally collapses. So it's interesting to note that by a very small margin, the history of Australia could have been completely different, coming under Spanish rule. Would a fleet sailing from Chile have been enough? Would it have been enough if a naval battle had not happened, or for the minister to live a few more years? Today it's strange to imagine the Pacific dominated by the Spanish Empire, but in 1796 that seemed quite possible to happen. And that's exactly what makes the story so fascinating. Sometimes, entire civilizations survive not because they are invincible, but because their enemies arrived too late. And did you know about the Spanish plan to take over Sydney? What surprised you the most? So leave your comment right now to support our work. And become a member right here on the channel right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.